At this time. Our Father, we thank you for this rain you sent upon the earth tonight to nourish it. But we're most especially thankful for this opportunity we have to come into the house, to hear thy word proclaimed, to think about the lessons that the Old Testament was teaching and the applicability of Ecclesiastes to the world around us right now. It's amazing how, even though long ago that this book was written, it still has relevance today, and it will speak to us, give us comfort, strength, hope, and point us to a better tomorrow. The whole theme of the Bible and the theme of man's redemption and God's grace towards us. We thank you for this. We thank you for bringing Eric here tonight. We ask that you give him safe travels back home. There are many of our members here that have been mentioned. It's hard to believe, but we're coming up on 6 months for John Biles since his transplant. It won't be long. He'll be making a trip back to Houston and having to do some checkups and start his shots over. It's part of the process. And others that we know of, May has been so slow to heal. Sheila in her process. There are just many that have physical ailments in this temporary vessel that we are placed in while here on this earth. But let us always keep our eyes on the prize. And the ultimate goal is for a perfect body in eternity with you, that Jesus gave us that golden gift of his life on our behalf. Be with us now as we enter into this service. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
It's the right one, but we're missing a few slides. There we go. 318, be thou my vision.
Mitch, give me a thumbs up. So good to be with you this evening. Thank you again for inviting me back. I was given permission to take this off. You know that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't want you to think I was breaking the rules, Phil. So I always look forward to this time of year, and I look forward to being with you all. And Sarah sends her greetings. She wishes she could be here. We have some company at home. Her sister's in town from Vermont visiting with us. So that's why she is not here with me tonight. But she also enjoys getting to see you guys in the summertime. And so I'm also excited about this theme that you've got going on this year. Ecclesiastes is a fascinating book. And now that I know that you've already had 10 lessons on, I'll try not to say things that I'm sure everybody has said about Ecclesiastes, but it is just really a unique book in our scriptures and provides a great insight into a point of view of a man who, from a worldly point of view, had everything. And isn't that a fascinating experiment? Isn't that a fascinating concept? You know, what is life like from that point of view? And in fact, he, of course, conducts a further experiment questioning what's the meaning of life under the sun. And we take that to mean if you were to limit the scope of your consideration to our experience here, and if you think of that as under the sun, life here, walking around, and if you don't consider anything beyond that, then it's easy to see how you would reach the conclusion, which he does over and over and over, that life under the sun, without taking any other things into account like eternity and God, life just on its own merits is pointless, vanity. And so it is a dark book in a lot of ways, a lot of despair, but there's a point to it, of course. It drives to a conclusion. And as we come to chapter 11, which is where we are tonight, we're edging up on the conclusion. We're edging up on where all of this has been leading all along, all of the darkness and despair. Of course, throughout the argumentation and the wisdom, there's bursts of sunlight here and there with some positive things and uplifting messages. And really, chapter 11 is a big kind of burst of sunlight as we begin to see a more perhaps balanced and positive, perhaps even optimistic kind of view of life here in chapter 11 before one final kind of, as chapter 12 begins, again, there's the kind of the sadness and darkness of the despair of when life loses its joys and aging takes hold, but I'll leave that to whoever's coming up next week. So we're going to get into chapter 11. Let me catch up with you in my scriptures there. It begins with a very interesting statement that's a little bit of a challenge to interpret. And the statement is, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth." And so as you think of cast your bread on the water, and Mitch, where'd you go? So if I move around, am I getting out of the camera? I know you're doing a live stream. Do I need to stay kind of here? Okay, all right, I'll stay here. I usually like to, we have the same, we have the same setup. Pardon? Within reason, right. So when I start to think of what mental image comes to mind with cast your bread on the water, I'm almost positive the first thought that comes to my mind is not the correct thought. But I don't know how many of the rest of you would go with your mom and the little sack of sandwich bread that was maybe a little stale or something. It's time to go to the park and feed the ducks, right? And so that's what, when I think of give some bread to 7 or to 8 and, throw it on the waters, but you don't get it back that way. So I don't think that's probably what he's talking about here. In fact, I'm positive that's not the idea, but it is the first thing. The only time I in my life can remember throwing bread on the water was so a duck would come over and get it. So what does he mean by cast your bread on the waters? There's really a couple of interpretations that are kind of put forward. But first of all, just notice in the context here in this section how much of this is emphasizing an output. Casting, giving, sowing. Look at the kind of language that's used. In verse 1, cast your bread. In verse 2, give a portion. In verse 3, it talks about the clouds that empty themselves on the earth. All these things are pictures of something giving away or putting out. He talks about in verse 4 that he who observes the wind will not sow, so it's still in the context of sowing, scattering. And then in verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, in the evening do not withhold your hand. So over and over here, I highlighted it on mine, and you see this idea of giving away, casting, sowing, scattering, emptying out is the theme. It seems like this traces through this first paragraph down through verse 6. And that's an interesting contrast to the earlier picture of gathering and collecting. Back in chapter 2, if you would turn back over to chapter 2, you get kind of a different image here of somebody who is gathering up and collecting as much as they can possibly have. Anybody ever had a pet hamster? You know how they love to it's amazing what all they'll pack into it's like they'll take as much as they can possibly get. And Solomon here in chapter 2 is describing this, beginning in verse 4. Notice he said, I made great works, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens, and he goes on, verse 6, I made myself pools and so forth. Verse 7, I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions, herds and flocks. Verse 8, I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eye desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. What was the result of all this? Verse 11, then I considered all that my hands had done, the toil I expended in doing it. Behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. This whole context is he was amassing, pulling in, pooling, hoarding, gathering, collecting. And he found that to be a very unsatisfying exercise when he stepped back and looked at the whole thing. And he's got more than anybody's ever had. And that didn't give life any purpose or meaning. And in fact, oddly enough, he goes on to say, like, the one thing that kept him up at night and drove him crazy during this time was the thought that it was going to someday go to someone else. Look in verses 18 through 21. This is chapter 2 still, I hated all my toil which I toiled on the sun, seeing that I must leave it to a man who will come after me. Who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool? Yet he'll be the master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is also vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who's toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil. You just think that's really to me, an interesting thing to be just torn up about. But it was just eating him alive. Now, he couldn't even enjoy what he had for the thought that one day someone else who didn't work as hard as he did was going to have it and get to enjoy it, and they didn't have to put in the effort. And that robbed him of the joy of even having it, which is interesting and sad and tragic and a little bit of insight into his thinking there. He concludes that in verse 21, this is also vanity and a great evil. The great evil is that someone else was going to enjoy the stuff that he had piled up and amassed. That's strange, I think. Well, so anyway, in chapter 2, it's just describing this amassing. But in chapter 11, in our text, over and over and over, it's casting away and giving and investing and sowing. And so it's just a really interesting contrast in the picture there from chapter 2, where he was driving himself into despair, hoarding, it seems like, as much as he could possibly have, to now, I think, coming to a clearer picture of a balanced life and a good life is a life that's not just about me and how much I can pile up in my corner, but is a life that involves putting things out, giving things, sowing. With that said, looking at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11, he says, scatter your bread, or cast your bread on the waters. And that poses a challenge. There's basically two interpretations of that particular thing. We know, I think we can be sure that it's in some way giving away or putting it out, but in what context? Some of the newer translations, like the NIV, render it like this: ship your grain across the sea, and after many days you may receive a return. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come upon the land. So traditionally, down through the ages, this has been understood to be a call for charity. Cast your bread on the water was understood by the ancients to mean to give to others, and that's kind of the second meaning. We'll come to it. But as I was reading commentaries and just looking at different notes, I found that it seemed like more modern scholars are leaning toward this idea that maybe it's talking about going into business and investing in some venture. And then if that's the case, the give to 7 or to 8, for you do not know what's coming, would indicate maybe diversifying, not having all of your eggs in one basket. I'm not sure if that's what he means or not. If it is, then it's possibly kind of a response to an earlier complaint. Look in chapter 5 and notice what he says in verses 13 and 14. There's a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by the owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. He's the father of a son. He has nothing in his hand. So he's seeing this problem where someone had things, but they kept them to themselves, to their own hurt, and they lost them in a bad venture. And if that's the case, then perhaps if this picture of bread on the water has something to do with a business venture, then it might be talking about being a good steward or taking what you've got and then reinvesting it and spreading it around. If that's the case, and if we were looking for a spiritual application of that or a lesson we could learn from it, of course, we can think of the parable of the 1 talent man who basically kept what he had to his own hurt and did not use it and invest it. And this is making a spiritual point, but Jesus talks about him and says, he who received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. I was afraid. I went and hid my talent in the ground. And then he says, here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gathered where I scattered no seed. You ought to have invested my money with bankers, and at my coming I would have received what was my own with interest. So there is a spiritual and scriptural principle that says when you've been blessed with something from God, you should use that and be a wise steward of that. That might be your time. It might be actual money. It may be some skill that you have. And as recipients of God's grace and God's gifts, we're expected to invest those things and put them to use and then get a good return. And that's something that's held up as virtuous and good throughout the Scriptures. And so that's one way to look at this. I had never thought of that before, but the NIV renders it that way. The New English Translation, NET Bible, renders it the same way. And then some commentaries talk about that. So I wanted to point that out. But probably the more traditional view of this, casting your bread on the water, is that it has to do with charity. Especially, you would think of if you throw your bread on the water, like on a river or you're never going to see it again. But the message is cast your bread on the water, and surprise, surprise, it'll come back to you. So how is that going to happen? Certainly not when the ducks get it. But it may be that if you're a giving kind of person, you will be blessed. It'll come back around somehow. Jesus, of course, says, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. So maybe the picture here of casting bread on the water is taking what you have and being willing to give it. And then if that's the case, he says give to 7 or to 8. In other words, just be generous and give away those things. And surprise, surprise, even though you would think if you throw some bread on the water, that's it, you'll never see that again. In God's way of working things out, if you're a giving, generous person, that tends to come back around, and you tend to reap a reward from that. Whether in this life or in the life to come, we can be sure that we will be blessed if we are giving and generous. Paul, in 2 Corinthians, uses this very same kind of sowing analogy that's later in our context. He's going to talk about sowing seed. And Paul is here talking to the church at Corinth about giving to help needy people. And Paul says, the point is this, Well, let me skip down to verse 8 where we are. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, He has distributed freely. He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. In the context there, he's saying that if you are generous in giving, God will multiply your seed. And that's an interesting thing about farming, that the more you farm, the more seed it produces. And that seed, of course, is the beginning of the next harvest. So it multiplies. We all understand that. And he's using that same picture to say, when you've been blessed by God and you reinvest that in a sense by sharing it with others and doing good, helping other people and giving it away, you would think what you have would go down, but in a surprising kind of way, the more you give it away, what you have will be multiplied. This is not a get-rich kind of plan, of course, but just talking about how when we will be blessed, you almost can't give away too much to outdo how much God will bless us and take care of us, and it's a reward that we get for being kind and good. And that's a joy that we get out of life, as opposed to the picture of the guy who is piling up and miserly and stingy and wanting to hold everything, and he ends up he can't even enjoy what he's got, and he's bitter and scared somebody else is going to get it. And now imagine that and contrast that with the picture of somebody who is just gladly giving it away and able to enjoy life even more. And so it's a beautiful contrast of two ways of looking at life, I believe. And so that's maybe something in there about this throwing your bread on the water. It's one of those verses I've always been a little bit interested in. What does he mean? And maybe you have some thoughts that you'd like to share with me later. But that's what I've been able to find so far in studying for this lesson. That also fits with verse 3, this idea, and I meant to have these, behind that text is a big picture of a cloud. Verse 3, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where it falls, there it will lie. That second part of that's another one of those interesting ones, like throwing your bread on the water. What is this tree talking about? I don't have a whole lot to share with you on that, but I do think the cloud one is pretty easy to figure out. So he says if a cloud is full of water, what's the cloud going to do? It's going to dump it out. So in the context of someone who had amassed a lot, in the context of someone who's been blessed, the cloud is designed by God not to just hold water up there in the air, but just like tonight, the cloud's been designed to pour that water out somewhere and be a blessing. And so if we have been blessed with stuff, we should think of ourselves as a cloud that can then go somewhere else and pour that out and be a blessing in some other place. And this parable that I've got on the screen, of course, is the man who had the bumper crop and had more than he was expecting, and he has to think, what am I going to do? And he decides, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns. And God says, that very night, your soul is required of you, and then whose will these be? Which is interesting, because that was Solomon's whole concern. Now that you've stored all that up, where's it going to go now? You can't take it with you. And he says at the end, verse 21, so is everyone who lays up treasure for himself, that's the chipmunk thing, and is not rich toward God. So we don't want to be guilty of being the cloud that never rains, that just soaks up water but holds it and isn't a blessing somewhere. We want to be giving and use what God has given us for His glory. And the second half of the verse says, if a tree falls to the north or the south, wherever it falls, that's where it will lie. Usually this is, if you just think about the picture it's painting, a tree falling over is dying. That's it for the tree. And so most people kind of latch on to the idea that it seems like it's talking about this tree dying. Jerome, the ancient, went so far as to say whether it lies to the north or to the south is indicating that when someone dies, their eternal fate is sealed. Whatever it is, when they die, that's what it will be forever, and there's no way to change it. I don't know if that really fits in the context of what he's talking about here, but certainly I think the picture of once that tree has fallen on the ground, that's it for the tree, and it's not going to do anything else, and it isn't going to have any more opportunities to bear fruit or anything else. It's over. And maybe maybe it's like a wake-up call. We have seen these throughout Ecclesiastes, where he talks about it's good to be reminded of death. It's good to go to the house of mourning. It's good to think about that, because maybe it'll motivate us to be wise with the time we have. And so in the context of giving and using and investing and being a good steward, being mindful of the fact the day is going to come when we're going to fall over, and it's going to be over then. So there won't be any time now after that point to make good use of what you've been blessed with. So do it now. And maybe that's the idea of this. Maybe that's how the tree fits into this section of that. The next verse 4, fits into a lot of situations. He who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. This is obviously the danger of being overly cautious and maybe even making excuses, but it's the picture of somebody that goes out every day, and for some reason today, he's trying to decide, is it good? It's not a good day. And I remember when I was a kid, we had this old house in Athens that Mitch and Julie had been to, and it was Dad hired some guys to paint it, and they would, like, only one day out of the week, it seems like, would be a suitable day for painting. It was either too humid, or it was going to, the weather wasn't right. It was going to be a little bit too warm, or it was going to get a little cool overnight. But it was crazy how many days were not suitable days for painting for those guys. And so it took forever to get the job done. That's kind of the idea here. If we're always looking for some reason why, if you're always looking at the sky, you'll never actually gather in a crop. You'll never actually get any work done. And in fact, it goes even farther than that to being, as Spurgeon would say, he has a sermon. Charles Spurgeon had a sermon on this verse, and the title of his sermon was Sowing in the Wind and Reaping Under the Clouds. And he has this statement in it. He says, if we keep on observing circumstances instead of trusting God, we shall be guilty of disobedience. God bids me sow, because the wind would blow some of my seed away. I do not sow. God bids me reap. I do not reap, because there's a black cloud there, and before I can house the harvest, some of it may be spoiled. I may say what I like, but I am guilty of disobedience. So his point is that if we're supposed to if God's told us to do something, let's don't make excuses. Let's just have faith and do what God's told us to do. And don't, if we're looking for some reason not to do it, we'll always be able to find something. But we want to be busy about God's work, put faith in God. Now, we may not know how God does what he does. In fact, we can be sure that we won't know. In verse 5, he says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. It's humbling to think about our own existence is a mystery to us. We don't understand that, really. I mean, you might say, yeah, but we understand, we've all had the talk, and we know we understand the biology of things. Yes, but do you know how is it that the spirit of a human being, you, me, who you are, came into existence in the womb? I don't think anybody would claim that we actually have that figured out, that we know how a living human being, cells multiply and divide all the time, but how does that turn into a person with a consciousness and a soul? Made in the image of God, alive, that remains a mystery. And he's saying you don't know that, and that's something that happens every day all over the place. And in fact, it's part of our own personal history. How we came to be is a mystery. So there's a lot of things about what God does that we have to, if we're being honest, we don't understand. And it's good to be humble. And I think that humility in this context of doing what God has told us and trusting God, that if you, again, cast your bet on the water, it's going to come back to you. You might think that doesn't make any sense. If I throw my bread on the water, I'm never going to see it again. But trusting God says, hey, if you do what I'm telling you, I'm going to take care of you. You'll be better off. If you do things it's easy to see the logic behind the hoarding mentality. I need to gather up as much as I can. I need to keep as many things. If I want to be happy, I need more stuff. And when God says, no, actually, if you want joy, if you want life to be good, you need to just trust in me and do things my way and don't worry about all that. That requires some faith. But faith acknowledges that I don't understand everything about God and how God does what he does. I'm going to just trust that God can do what he says and that his way is better and that he knows better than I do. And it's pretty easy to see why we should trust God when we stop and think about it, because there's a whole lot of things about life, even the simple things, that we don't really have figured out and can't understand. And so, as it goes on in verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, whether both alike will be good. You could take this in either of the context of being industrious or being generous and charitable. In either case, basically, you could think of Ephesians making wise use of the time, redeeming the time for the days are evil. Just make the most of your opportunities. Don't let them pass by. You only live this life once. What opportunity did we have today that we could have made better use of? What can we do tomorrow? In the morning, in the evening, or in Galatians 6, when you think about it in terms of charity, as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially to the household of faith. So that when that opportunity presents itself, take advantage of it and do something. Make something of it. One day the tree's going to fall over, and that's going to be the end of it. So this is the chance we have now to be scattering and to be sowing and to be working and to be productive. And again, you see that would give life a sense of meaning and purpose. So I think we see, as the argument or the thought experiment has progressed through the book, from life is completely empty and pointless, and well, if I'm 100% focused on myself and I'm only interested in me and what I want, you can see why that would not lead to any kind of real satisfaction. But sowing, giving, investing, scattering, that kind of thing is a very rewarding way to go through life. Now, the second half of the chapter is a different, kind of starts a different picture. And I like the picture that it paints here. Let's just go ahead and read 7 through 10. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart, and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Solomon hasn't abandoned his theme in this. Vanity is mentioned twice in verse 8 and in verse 10. You see vanity. On its own terms, life is still under the sun. He still maintains that life is vanity, but it doesn't mean that there's no reason to not enjoy the good things in life. And it's interesting, throughout the book, he has given us little glimpses of some of those good things. And he adds to the list. It's good to be in the sunlight. It's good for the eyes to see the sun. It's good to be outside. It's good to be in the light. It's a blessing. Light is sweet. This is one of those good things. And there's been other things throughout the book here and there. Kind of like I picture like little breaks in the cloud when some light would shine down. Verse 24 of chapter 2, of course, said, there's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This I saw is from the hand of God. Chapter 3, verse 12, I perceive there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. Chapter 8 and verse 15, and I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. And in fact, it's interesting, he's saying that even though life he found, in all these different ventures of things he tried, it left him feeling empty, he kept coming back to that the simple things, which are available to everybody, not just some rich king, but the simple things like a meal, seeing a hard day's work, there's a pleasure in that, in toil, there's a joy in that. Those are available to everybody, and that's what's neat about that. It's not something just, certain privileged, wealthy people could have. But the joys that God has built into this existence are something that we all have access to in that sense, those simple things in life. And he talks about what a shame it would be. Look at chapter 6 and verse 3. Imagine a man who lives his life and never enjoys the blessings that God has built into this existence. What a tragedy that would be. He says in chapter 6, verse 3, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and also he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. You know, and there, if you were to define success, it would be in there, especially in some cultures, it's having tons of children. That's kind of a mark of being successful and blessed. And you know, if he says if a man had all these kids, and another would be if he lived a long time. He lived a long time. He's basically he's meet all the benchmarks of what people would define as the ultimate in success. But if he's not able to enjoy it, and if he doesn't enjoy the good things in life, it would be better, you know, it's like, what has he really accomplished? I think Jesus would say it, you know, what does it profit a man if he gained the whole world, you know, and forfeits his soul? What good would there be if you get all these things, but if you don't have what matters the most? And in this case, I think he's even saying, if you have everything, but you're not able to enjoy those simple pleasures. And so in our text, he is saying and reminding us to enjoy what is here in life. And that's not as an end in themselves. In chapter 2, you know, he said, I didn't withhold myself from any pleasures, and I tried them all and found them all to be left him wanting. And they don't provide any lasting meaning or depth or purpose or fulfillment. That's not their, you know, like the joy of a good meal. I mean, you could eat the best food in the world. It doesn't, you know, when it's all said and done, you're going to get hungry again. It leaves you still hungry. So it's not an end in itself. We're not eating and drinking machines. We're not here just to, you know, satisfy our appetites. But having said that, those are blessings that God has built into every day. And just like a father would want his children to enjoy the things he's given them, our Father wants us to enjoy the blessings that he has given us in this life. He wants us to enjoy those things. They're here for us to enjoy. An example of this is in Proverbs, where he says, my son, eat honey, for it's good, and the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. Hey, God put that there. It's sweet. It's good. Enjoy some of it. You know, it's here for you and me, and it's to be enjoyed. And I think that's a neat thing about our Father, you know, as Jesus compares him to that when he talks about, you know, which father among you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone. You know, he says, your Father, if you who are evil know how to give your children good things, don't you think your Father? But he asks us to think in terms of, as a father yourself, don't you delight in giving your children, you know, good things? You take pleasure in that. And our Father is the same way. He wants us to have things that we need and that are good for us. And he wants us to have things to enjoy. And he wants this life, I believe, to be filled with those kinds of blessings. And what a sad thing it would be if somebody somehow, because they were not focused on the right things, or because they were so perhaps greedy, or you know, whatever the case may be, lived their whole life not enjoying the blessings that God has given to us. Now, of course, and again, in our context here, he's focuses kind of on two things in this paragraph. One of them is enjoying the sunlight, enjoying those, you know, the good things in life. But the other is the joys of youth and how fleeting that is. And when he says there in verse 9, rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Even with honey, you know, there's a time in your life when it seems like you can have as much of whatever you enjoy. You know, and then you get to a certain point where you have to start thinking about how much carbs are in honey, and you know, is that good for me? And only one of those cookies. And you know, you get to a time in life when some of the sheen, you know, you can't ride the rides at the park anymore because you get sick. That's a real letdown. I didn't see that coming, by the way. I always thought there was something wrong with some, you know, old fogies like my parents that didn't want to get on the roller coasters. And it's like, come on, I'm going to be one of those cool old people that'll ride the rides from now on. but I can't take it. I'd just as soon let the kids go, and it'll be it's a little rough anyway, and you kind of get a headache, and it's like, I don't know why that's even fun anymore. But age, as we all know, and next week's lesson is going to really dwell on this a lot, that age tends to take some of those joys out of life. And that's part of what we all get a kick out of, seeing young people and just watching them explore and experience things and play in a creek, or, just all those things that kids just, tumbling around the floor and laughing. We vicariously enjoy that. And it reminds us of those days. But that's part of being young, and it goes away. And so he's saying here, don't miss out on that, you young people. Enjoy those moments while you can. One of the commentaries I read had a quote from William Wordsworth, and he says this about youth: "Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day." Although it's pretty neat when you just stop and think about it. But you just sort of see almost a glow around children that kind of wears off as we get a little older. And that's just part of it. It's not, it sounds depressing. And I'm sorry, it probably sounds depressing, right? It's okay to get older, though. Don't worry about it. There's some joys and pleasure that come with maturity too, I will say. But there are joys of youth. And that's one of those blessings that God's built into life. And I believe He wants us to enjoy it. And how sad is it truly that there are so many young people that you hear about who are in despair. And it's just such a tragedy at a time in your life when you should be carefree, and that it's not true for everybody. And that's not the way the Lord would desire it to be, for sure. We can be confident of that. So this idea of youth and age will continue. I do want to say also here, as he's saying, enjoy all these things, he reminds them that you're going to stand before God in judgment. So here's the proper perspective, I think, on joys in this life. Earlier in the book, he experimented with, what if you just completely give yourself to joy, to pleasure? And he found that to be empty. But not only is it empty, we understand it's sinful as well. The Lord has never intended for us to just be compelled by fulfilling the desires of the flesh. That's the way of the Gentiles, Peter says. That's what they do. That's the people who don't know God. They just try to live for physical, sensual pleasures, and that's not the way the Lord would have us to live. But the Lord doesn't call us to asceticism either, a life of denying ourselves any kind of enjoyment. That's not the right. That's nowhere in the Bible that the Lord would want us to not enjoy things. And so the right balance here, if we're trying to find out where is the way of wisdom, and wisdom is this pathway that's being illuminated for us here. The path of wisdom is to enjoy those things with two things in mind. One, that they are not an end of themselves that gives us any lasting meaning. They're just blessings along the way. But also with an eye toward eternity and judgment, and to pleasing God and living for Him. If you have those two things in mind, then you can go enjoy what's out there, and that will steer you away from things that are sinful and bad, but allow us to enjoy what God has given us that's good and right for us to have. And so that's really, I think, as we're getting closer and closer to the end of the book, we're getting a little preview here of the conclusion of the matter, which is what life is really all about. Okay, bringing it to a close, let's consider 4 points really quickly for you as we're just looking for some kind of bullet point takeaways. On this idea of throwing bread on the water and you get it back, perhaps we can just summarize that as it's more blessed to give than to receive. Take what you've got and then put it out there in some way. Like use it, reinvest it. Take your profit and then reinvest it. And that could be in a lot of different ways. You could think of that in a lot of ways. But one way would certainly be in showing kindness and charity, love to others. And in that way we will be blessed ourselves. And then, make the most of every day that we have. And whether that be in industry or whether that be in charity, sow in the morning, sow in the evening, just be be busy. Make use of those opportunities, recognizing that this life is fleeting and it's going to one day end. This is our chance. We're here. The big old world's going to keep going around and around until the Lord comes back, but one day we'll all be gone. And so let's make the use of the time that He's blessed us with. And as we go through life, it pleases me to think about the fact that God has built into life all these blessings, that He wants us to rejoice. He doesn't desire for His people to be miserable or to miss out on those pleasures in life. And so let's look for those and enjoy them when we find them, because that's what God, our Father, would want us to do, keeping in mind all along the way the ultimate goal, which is to be prepared to stand before Him one day, because for all these things He will bring us into judgment. And then what He has in store for us, we can only imagine. Paul says it's not worth comparing to all this. The glory that is to be revealed, the surpassing eternal weight of glory, we can only imagine how wonderful that will be. But if we want to really look forward to that, we have to live now, preparing ourselves for that day. So as we decide what we're going to enjoy and what we're going to stay away from, keeping in mind that one day we'll stand in judgment before Him is the right way to do that. Perhaps there's someone tonight even who has something in your life that you need to make right, so you would be ready to stand before Him in judgment. We certainly always want to offer that opportunity, and if there's some way that we can help you make that right tonight, we'll be glad to do so if you let us know as we stand and sing.
He lives. God sent His Son, they called Him Jesus. He came to love, heal, and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. Because He lived, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. And then one day I'll cross that river. I'll fight life's final war with pain. And then as death gives way to victory, I'll see the lights of glory, and I'll know He reigns. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives.
David, how many do we have tonight?
37.
37. We're certainly glad to see everyone here this evening. Plus the others who are online, of course, and that is part of what we're trying to do to encourage everyone. You know, the book of Ecclesiastes is really a book for those who are young, But on the other hand, it is really a book that can only be explained by those who are older. We have invited these men in to take a part of this book and help us to understand it. And we're very appreciative, Eric, for the time you put into preparing to help us understand some things that are difficult in the book of Ecclesiastes. I think the culmination is going to come next week with chapter 12. And we look forward to that. And this has been a beneficial and profitable study for us this summer. If you will, bow with me as we pray and close the service. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we've had this day, that we've had this rain, that we've had all the good things that you showered down upon us. These are blessings from your hands. We've asked you, Father, for your care for many of our number who are unwell. And we thank you, Lord, for the blessing that you've provided in restoring the health to so many. Lord, as we leave this place and darkness has fallen, we ask you to guide us safely home, and especially Eric back to his family. We praise your name, Holy Father, and we thank you in the name of your Son. Amen.
Good.